Hi everybody, so I'm Jon Willemse and today I want to talk to you guys about SSL pinning for Android and iOS. So thank you all for having me here. I was just wondering before I get started, who of you is active in the mobile field as a pen tester, developer or risk guy, whatever? Okay, who of you is actually involved in the whole pinning process of those hands that were raised? That's just a very few, so apologies for all the others. If I'm very boring, just say so and we'll skip some stuff. And let's just make this interactive as much as possible. I have a lot of stuff. So you'll see a few QR codes which you can scan, which point you to a handout. You can download that. So for the guy that rose his hand at the end that was interested in the pinning part, you can then get all the technical details there. So who am I? I'm Jon Willemse. I work for a beautiful company called Xibia. I'm called a security architect or security coach or whatever you want to call that. I've been a developer for a very long time, still am, because I think you should combine those things. So it's mostly on helping teams to evolve their security in their software development lifecycle, which kind of makes me an application security specialist, or whatever you want to make of that. So we have a pretty filled agenda here. First of all, I want to talk about, well, should you pin at all? And if so, where should you pin to? Then we want to have the obvious discussion of leaf versus root certificates, whether you should hardcode it or use HTTP public key pinning. Then we're going to talk a bit more about the technical details for iOS and Android, and then some basic verification. There's a handout which you can download at the B-Sides website, which basically gives all the technical details as well, so you can actually use that. So let's start with the beginning. Because obviously, why should you pin? Well, you have to start somewhere, and that's of course because of TLS. So everybody understands how TLS works, right? I don't have to explain all the details there. If anyone doesn't, raise your hand. Well, that's good. So basically, when you do your handshake to get the public key where you can encrypt your symmetric key, we have to do the actual payload encryption. You get a bunch of certificates offered. So you have your leaf certificate, which is signed by an intermediate or directly by a root CA or itself signed, etc., etc. And now somebody wants to do man-in-the-middling there. So basically, he can't because he needs to have the private key of the leaf certificate or something else. Because what if you could compromise a root CA? It's like DigiNotar, everybody knows this story, right? Or what if just somebody makes awful mistakes over there, which happens still a lot. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, as little as possible actually. Or if somebody starts entering rogue certificates in the trust store of your actual device. Well, obviously you then need to have physical access for some malware running there, so that's a bit of an issue. But the way easier way is just to trick users to installing it, because you can run the most awesome app in your life only if you install this. Otherwise you pay 60 bucks or 10, depending on the platform, because Androidians, well, they don't pay that much money as the Apple users do on average. So yeah, you can get it for free, but you have to install this profile and this certificate and everything will be fine. About those mistakes, so in, I don't think if you can see it, yeah, on SSLmate.com you can see the beautiful story of all the things that went wrong and things that will probably go wrong in the future. So yeah, there's reason to do pinning, but before you're gonna wonder whether you should do pinning, the major question that I hardly see addressed is whether the organization is mature enough. Wait, what? Yeah, because technicalities, I mean coding and stuff and putting some certificate somewhere and running OpenSSL to get some data, that's not hard. The hard part is making sure your certificate can stay where it's at. Because the moment it's no longer there and you're pinning to something that's no longer there, your app stops working. So that's actually the major question you should ask your clients first, whether it's a bank or something else. So it basically takes proper certificate lifecycling to do the pinning correctly. If you make sure you have a proper certificate lifecycle, if you make sure that if you do public key pinning that your public key remains there and you don't do anything else, it might work. But the in-app implementation, so guiding an app developer to do his job right, that's not hard. That's just, here it is, copy, paste, follow the recipes and go. We'll still discuss some of those recipes, by the way, just to make things easier, so you can just offer them directly. And the hardest part actually is protecting the private key belonging to the public key you're pinning to or the certificate you're pinning to. If you can't protect that, then you have to move along, and the app is still pinning to something that isn't secure. What's the bigger risk? Right, so only pin if you have something valuable to protect and you don't trust the PKI infrastructure or how people are using it right now. So, well, banks make sense, social media makes sense, games that want to prevent cheaters and use microtransactions, again, makes sense. But just your regular Angular conference app, yeah, I don't think it makes sense. So, if you're pinning, remember that pinning doesn't protect you against local attacks. If a guy has his hands on your device or has access to the device, pinning doesn't help. It might frustrate him for just 10 seconds and then it's gone. So yeah, that doesn't work. So what should you pin to? So over here, who doesn't recognize what this is? Who does? Can I see some? Right, cool. So this is a certificate, obviously. You can pin to the full certificate. So you can either put it in a trust store and then make sure that you're pinning to the full thing, or you can actually do byte by byte comparison. I've seen that too. Or you just pin to the fingerprint of the public key information, or the thumb, or directly to the public key itself, or a hash of the public key. And I've seen both over there as well. And how does this compare to one another? So in terms of ease of installation, in the old days, if you just put the certificate in the trust store, that's way easier because you don't have to use specific libraries or specific code or whatever. But lately, the last 2 years, as PKI or public key pinning has become equally easy. There's a bunch of libraries that support that. And the expiry is interesting because when your certificate expires and you have to put a new one there, then obviously that pin won't work. But if you reuse the same public key for your next CSR, so you'll have the same public key again, you can continue, which lead to different type of challenges. So, for instance, if you're pinning to a CA, you might have different certificates for the given CA, and you have to update more often. But now, all of a sudden, if you start pinning to the public key, you have to ask yourself, wait, how long can I use this public key? When should I really rotate? Because I'm in control now. No longer the certificate lifecycle itself is the problem, but I'm the problem now. How much risk do we have? When do we have to rotate? And how do we prepare for that? So leaf versus root certificates. So basically, let's say this is your average PKI infrastructure with, for every root CA, there's another tree basically. And this is yours, your domain. And here's somebody who, well, got some intermediate cert, starts giving out certificates for perhaps your domain as well. And how do you make sure that then nobody gets in there? So if you're pinning to multiple root CAs or a single one, obviously you're still in the same trouble because it's in the chain. You're pinning to that, you can't see that you are in trouble. If you start pinning to a given intermediate certificate, the attack surface is already much smaller. But the problem is, of course, now that you're still not completely in control mostly of that intermediate certificate. So there's issues there. But the cool stuff is that you now can start pinning for multiple subdomains if you have multiple different leaf certificates, for instance. But if you pin to the exact leaf certificate where you want to work with, then it's obvious the safest thing. But now all of a sudden you have to do this for every domain where you have a separate certificate for. So you can hardcode it, which basically means you just put it in your application, say this is the specific pin where I want to pin to, and nothing else. But the moment you rotate your public key or your leaf certificate, it no longer works. So you have a lifecycle problem there. Yeah, obviously you can pack away the future public key, but this means that your organization needs to be ready to stock the other private key of that public-private key pair somewhere else and keep it safe. And obviously I'm talking to security guys right now that think, oh, we can do that. Talk to developers. They can, but you'll have to teach them. So, yeah, if you use HTTP public key pinning, which is beautifully described in this RFC. So basically, you're sending your server sends a header with a bunch of details in there. The most important parts are these two pins. So that's basically the hash over your SPKI. And if it matches with the offered certificate, then you're okay. It's trust on first use, tofu, so it makes vofu. If the user spins up the app the first time in a compromised environment, then obviously you can interact with this. And the funny thing is, if you have a mobile application, then obviously the first time you start it, you're entering your registration information, which is often the PII you're trying to protect. So this might be a bit spiffy. But depending on how your app is using and the risk is involved, this is actually okay. And of course you need a backup pin. So how do you get the materials to pin? I'm just going to quickly go over this. There's a bunch of OpenSSL commands you can use, and they're also on the handout. You can copy them there or from the slides. So, pinning in Android. Well, the coolest thing is with Android Nougat, you basically get a beautiful network security configuration. It's some XML. When you get your hash, you put it in here, which is basically the thumbprint, and you're good. It's this simple. You can basically define for which domain you want to use it. You include subdomains. You can create a set of different domains to do this. So it's all highly configured. That only works, by the way, if you have Android N running on your device. All right, cool. Because right now, that's just this little part of the pie, and then you have the rest of the world to figure out. Well, if your app is only there for high-end users that have money for new phones, why bother? But mostly when we create apps, you have to take the other one in as well. So how does that work? Before Android Nougat, basically you have to obtain it. You have to load the certificate in the key store, basically the stuff I already talked about. And then you have a trust manager that trusts it, and then you validate the materials, and you're good. And then for public key, it mostly means that you have to create your own trust manager. Here is where many developers make many mistakes, so let's not go there. But you can also do it differently. Oh yeah, and before you, by the way, do that, you have to clean the chain, because an attacker might offer the man in the middle might offer a set of certificates where his rogue certificate is in as well, and so is the actual certificate that is pinned by the developer. And then still, he can use that rogue certificate or its public key from that to do the actual handshake, even though your pinner said this is fine. So you have to clean up the chain first. There was a lot of fuss about that, I think 2 years ago by now. So in Android API level 17, this has been fixed. You can use the X509 Trust Manager extensions, but that's not a large part of the pie. That's still halfway, which means that you have some issues. Obviously, you can't use the OpenSSL library because in the latest version of Android, you can no longer do a lot of low-level hooks anymore. So you really have to go with the flow of what Android is offering you. The cool part is you can actually do this relatively easy for many API levels using OKHTTP3. So that's a pretty modern HTTP client for Android, which is used a lot by developers, luckily. There's actually a recipe in there, so we'll just go through it quickly. Basically, you initialize it first. You connect, you get a stack trace, because obviously this is not the pin you're looking for. And then you select the one you want to pin to, so leaf certificate or intermediate or root. And there you have your pinning. Ta-da, that's cheap. And then you update the pinner and you're ready. An alternative is TrustKit for Android. So if you don't want to go all programmatically, but you just want to have that XML from Android Nougat, then TrustKit for Android can do this for you. Basically, you enable that, and then you can just still use that XML, and it will work. The only important thing is, of course, keep the library up to date if you're using OKHTTP3 or TrustKit or whatever, because the Android platform changes, and so does the library interaction with that platform. If that's not configured correctly, it might not work at all. So that's a good thing to take into account. So then iOS, which is actually relatively easy. So there's NS-URL connection, which has been used a lot. And these methods are deprecated, but still advised on many websites. And since they're deprecated by Apple, don't do it. Either in Swift you're using the connection will send request for challenge, or in Objective-C you're using connection will send request for authentication challenge. And there you implement the pinning. Don't try to use the deprecated methods, because that will give you trouble. So how do you do that then? So first you load the certificate in a dir format, because that's what the libraries understand. Then you basically select the certificate you want to pin to using the verb, basically. Oh, and you don't have to do cleaning, because that's what Apple does for you. Thank you, Apple. And then evaluate server trust, and if everything is fine, verify whether it's the same and move along. Or you can let this be done by a library, which I would still recommend a bit. You can use Elemofire, where you can either say, okay, pin for the certificates or pin for public keys, which makes it relatively easy, because there you just put the stuff in, and then you're fine. The cool thing is it will just look for the certificates in bundles, so you can just put your dir file or your cert file or whatever somewhere in the application bundle. Just don't forget to make sure that it, when it's included, that you select the proper target to include it for, because otherwise this doesn't work. And then you initialize it and you're done. Oh yeah, and there's a funny thing with LMOfire. You have to disable app transport security because some of the hooks are overridden which LMOfire is using. So this should be a red flag to anybody that helps mobile developers. This might not be a good idea right now, but I figured they're working on it. All right, AF networking, which is way cooler. You get the public key stored as a SURF file, and then you initialize the operation manager, like over here with a policy. Just make sure it's somewhere in your bundle, same thing, different day, and then you move along. And then there's another alternative, another trust kit. This is actually the iOS version of the same trust kit. Get the pins you want to pin to, enter them either in the info plist file, which might not be the best idea. A better idea is just to put them in the configuration programmatically, because that takes a lot lesser problems to change those. But that's a different topic, by the way, and I'll give a slight pinner to that one. Then you have your basic verification. So basically it's all based on burp. You set up burp, you generate a certificate for a given domain and install it on your device. So just enter the domain name in the certificate generator for burp in the proxy settings and then go along. Then proxy your device through burp and try to connect to the designated domain. If you can, then something went wrong. And if so, try to repeat the same process, but then for any arbitrary host name in your certificate. And if you still can, then something definitely went wrong. And if not, your basic verification is completed. So that basically sums up all of that. And there's lots more for those who are interested in the mobile space. But I would invite you to go over here to the OWASP Mobile Security Testing Guide. A lot of people are working on that, and I would really love you guys to help us there, to collaborate, to add more stuff to it, to review stuff. Because in the end, this is something that developers are using right now as well, which speeds up the ecosystem quite well. So that's it. So some takeaways. Pin if you really have to. Don't pin if you're not ready. Don't pin if you don't have the residual risk that really needs this in-depth control. Pin only if you're mature enough. Select the node you want to pin to carefully. Think about that for a couple of seconds. I would say prefer public key pinning over certificate pinning, because by now that lifecycle thing should be pretty evident, I guess. Don't just do it yourself. Please use a library and keep that updated. And if you do it yourself, it's fine, but make sure you're experienced, you know what you're doing, and that you have somebody who helps you to evaluate it. And check the OWASP Mobile Security Testing guys for details, and feel free to correct or update it. Questions?
There's plenty of time left for questions, so that's good.
Great talk, by the way. So a question about iOS specifically. I think it was iOS 8 or 9 where ATS came out. And it crashed a whole bunch of apps because developers were looking at it and, I can't connect anymore. So do you see anything coming in, say iOS 11 or 12 in the next versions that could be as disruptive, specifically for this pinning issue?
That's hard to say, because there's betas coming out where we can start evaluating stuff, but you'll find out sometimes the hard way in the end. There's, I'm pretty sure stuff will happen, because what Apple is trying to do is trying to create a secure ecosystem for app developers that don't want to do these kind of things, but just make it work out of the box. And then the real problem is mostly not necessarily the developers, but it's the people that run our servers where they connect to, that all of a sudden aren't aligned anymore in the latest and greatest guidelines for Apple how to configure your TLS configuration. I think that's the major challenge.
So it's more the server developers that have to be worried less than the platform developers, so to speak.
In that sense, definitely. Okay. So having an early beta and start testing it is really recommended, not just for the app developer, but also for the opser that, or the developer that takes control of the server or infrastructure.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, really great talk. I had only one question. How do you prepare for compromised keys that you pin to? I heard people talking about a second pinning to a second certificate or public key. How do you feel about it, and how do you think it can best be implemented?
I think overall using public key pinning is the best way to go, but that means that you have to have separate public keys ready. So the actual challenge in pinning indeed is storing the secondary private key somewhere, or the combination of things, and make sure you deploy that correctly and not something else. So you can have multiple public keys already stored in your app. It's not a problem. But the real challenge is always managing those private keys. I think it's a great idea. You should always do that, because everybody hopes that the app will be updated correctly so that users will download the new version, but they won't. Even though the app is telling you, you have to update me, otherwise it won't work. Then first they'll start complaining in the Google Play Store, it doesn't work. Because they haven't read the notification because it's too much text in there, or it's unclear to them because they're just impatient. So in the end, having those multiple public keys is the best thing you can do, but really make sure you're mature enough to handle the private keys there.
So with a growing number of both nation states, but also corporations trying with the best of intentions to break SSL, either at network parameters or further down an ISP upstream chain, this is obviously not going to work, right? You're going to lock some users out of your application if you insist on pinning, right? If you use something like, let's say, TrustKit, or implement a Trust Manager in Android, you would have the flexibility to make this a modal choice, right? So you test against the certificate you're trying to pin, and then you give the user a choice saying, we can see that someone is actually trying to intercept your connection. Do you want to trust this connection or not? And then, kind of give the user the alternative to continue or not. Is this something you have experience with or have some thoughts on?
We did try that, because with OKHTTP you can of course have multiple clients, one configured with pinning and one without, but customers will just click OK. And that was just a simple experiment for ourselves. We offered it to a PO of a team that we were working for, and he was like, "Click, what did I just do?" And that was a security-minded PO. So the idea is great. But overall, I think if you manage your public keys correctly and your infrastructure correctly, the cutout of users won't be that much. But users aren't ready to make those decisions, because all we educated them, at least in the Netherlands, is if that key is correct on your website, you're fine. And on apps, your device is great, everything is fine. We won't understand.
Thanks.
Anyone else? And if not, thanks, Jeroen, for your session.
You're welcome.